Welcome to the Secrets of Personal Injury Law with Colin Bober.
Welcome to the Secrets of Personal Injury Law with Colin Bober. Colin is a personal injury attorney who has represented over 4,000 clients with a gross settlement recovery of over $50 million. I'm your host, Abigail Vaca, and today's episode is the hidden factors that can prolong your personal injury claim. Colin, so great to have you here.
Happy to be back.
So, in your experience, how often do cases end up taking longer than anticipated?
I don't think that there's a set time frame for a case to be resolved. The majority of the time that it takes to get a case resolved is based on the amount of time that it takes the client to receive the treatment they need to feel as comfortable as possible after the accident. Young kids, they recover quicker than older adults. And if you have a fracture of anything, then you have to consider the amount of time that it takes for the bone to heal. Or if you go through conservative care that doesn't resolve, maybe you turn into a surgical candidate 6 months to a year later. There's not really a set time frame of a case being resolved. It's more so focusing on how long it takes the client to get the care they need to be as close to pre-accident condition as possible, because we understand that usually after an accident, whether it's physical or psychological, nobody's ever the same.
Sure. So what are some of the other main factors that contribute to a personal injury case taking longer than expected?
Sometimes it has something to do with the insurance company making a decision as to whether they believe they're at fault or not. Sometimes it's finding out who's responsible. There are several cases that we've had where there is a multi-level car accident where you have 6 to 12 cars involved. Okay, so who started this whole thing? And if you have to identify who's responsible, obviously if you're going to file suit, you want to file suit in good faith and make sure you identify the correct party to the best of your ability, rather than, suing everybody and just seeing what sticks. So there's a level of investigation that's required to make sure that you're doing the best you can by your client, but also acting within the ethics as required by the bar to make sure you're not putting somebody through legal turmoil just for the fun of it. So that is something that causes cases to drag on longer. And on top of that, relating to the treatment and things like that it takes to get somebody to as close to their pre-accident condition as possible is something that will also cause a delay in the resolution.
That all makes sense. And I'd like to pivot back to something you mentioned before. How does the severity and the complexity of a client's injuries affect the timeline of a personal injury case?
That situation depends on what the diagnosis is and what the projected recovery time is. If you have a traumatic brain injury, then that is something that you're not going to recover from. You may never recover fully from that. And so it depends on when you find that injury exists and what the treatment plan is, and to be able to extrapolate that into the future to make sure that the client is adequately compensated. That is something that's very complex and won't even develop for quite a while. So the more complex the injury, the more analysis that a doctor needs to do to not only articulate what the injury is, but what the long-term effects of them are. So if somebody has a TBI that also diminishes their ability to smell, and the life care plan and long-term effect says that because they can't smell anymore, their house needs to be retrofitted so that they can have smoke alarms that make audible sounds instead of being able to smell something to accommodate that new life change, then that is something that needs to be considered. But you won't know that for a while. The only timeline that you have in the state of Texas is that the case must be resolved through settlement, or a lawsuit must be filed within 2 years to protect the statute of limitations. That's the only thing you have to be concerned about. But in terms of the development of the case, it takes as long as necessary to make sure that all factors are considered before a client is convinced or will feel comfortable to settle their case by signing on the dotted line.
That makes sense. And I want to pivot a little bit. So you mentioned timelines. In what ways can the negotiation process with insurance companies or even opposing parties cause delays in reaching a settlement?
Well, again, it's one of those things where it depends on which phase you're in. If you haven't filed suit yet, you'll make a demand and give a timeline for an offer. And usually, 9 times out of 10, both parties will go back and forth. The insurance company will draw a line in the sand and say, this is all we're offering, take it or leave it. Then, of course, you have the ethical obligation to present that to the client and, help them understand how it's calculated and why, and make sure that they're comfortable with it. If the settlement is not feasible, then the only option you can do is to file suit. And once you file suit, and you'll have to go through the discovery process, and there is no timeline for another offer to come in besides when the other side wants to make it. Because the only formal deadline you have at that point is your trial date, which could be 2 years later. But if the other party wants to go through discovery and exchange documents and do depositions to get testimony under oath, they can make an offer of settlement at any time, or they can wait till all those things are completed months later before they make an offer of settlement, because during that time of discovery, they're collecting information, we're collecting information, they're evaluating their exposure, and so are we. And so a lot of times insurance companies don't want to make any offers of settlement until they have all the information to make an informed decision. And we do the same. So it really depends on what's going on with the case so that we make the right decision. Because once a lawsuit is filed, you really don't have much leverage to push another offer until they want to make one.
Sounds like there's a lot of moving parts there.
There can be.
So what role do expert witnesses and medical evaluations play then when it comes to lengthening a personal injury case? And how are they vital for the outcome?
Well, for example, if somebody has a traumatic brain injury, the expert is the only one that can tell them they have it, right? I'm not qualified to. No attorney is qualified to make that determination. We can suspect based on symptomology, but only an expert is qualified to determine that, yes, they have a traumatic brain injury, and this is how that's going to affect them for the remainder of their life or whatever stage of life that they're in. The longevity of that can only be determined by an expert. So they're very vital, because you don't want an attorney making false statements to a jury that can easily be disproven. So expert testimony in regards to the medical care or the diagnosis of a client is probably the most important part, because without that, not only do they diagnose the injury, but they also outline the course of treatment that it's going to take for that client to be made whole through treatment or compensation.
Got it. So it sounds like your medical professional is going to be following along your journey as well.
Yeah, because and that's their distinct role. Their job is to look at the client, evaluate them in person, and render a medical opinion. And my job is to take that information and present that to a jury or an adjuster in a way that they understand to compensate this client fairly. Because attorneys, unless they have a medical background, don't have the autonomy or the ability to make medical determinations. And so the doctor is the only one that can outline that for me in a way to express it in a basic way for average citizens to understand, to award that compensation.
So can you talk a little bit more about how ongoing treatment or recovery can affect progression of a personal injury claim? Again, especially if those future medical needs are uncertain.
Every client is different, and not all clients want to go through a whole gambit of treatment. So it really depends on what the client is recommended for and what their long-term prognosis is. I mean, for example, if you have somebody who breaks their leg, then it's going to take at least 6 weeks for it to heal. And then if you go through surgery, you're going to have to go through surgery. You're going to have follow-ups. You're going to have physical therapy. Or if you break your dominant hand, then not only do you have to go through all those steps, you also have to be compensated for the lost time, because you've lost your ability to write. You've lost your ability to take care of your kids. I mean, there are a bunch of different aspects that need to be looked at before you reach a resolution of the case. But it's all dependent on what the injury is, how long a medical professional determines that it's going to heal, and whatever those long-term effects will be.
So as your client and yourself are navigating through all of this uncertainty, how do you, as the attorney, communicate with clients to keep them informed about delays and just ensure that they're staying engaged throughout the process?
We do our best to follow up with each client every 2 weeks, because at least in the treatment stage, we want to know where they are, if their treatment is beneficial to them or if it's not. I mean, nobody wants to keep going to treatment that they don't think is working. Obviously, everybody understands that it's best to be conservative and do your best to only get treatment that is medically necessary, which of course they couldn't get without the doctor's approval anyway. But then you have to go through a course of conservative care before you can start being aggressive. And that's important. It just depends on what the client's needs are and what it's going to take for them to feel comfortable before we try and settle.
I appreciate that, you meeting them where they're at.
Yeah, I mean, the whole purpose is to make sure that you provide them information to allow them to make the best decision for themselves. My job is to give them options and let them choose so that they know they had an option and they chose the best decision for themselves.
That's fantastic. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much, Colin. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And thank you for tuning in to The Secrets of Personal Injury Law with Colin Bober. To connect with Colin and his team, visit boberlawfirm.com. And please be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review on our channel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.